Okay, a few disclaimers. I'm going to talk fast in the beginning and try to slow down at the end, which is more original. This is a composite, I hope. This is a composite of 3 papers, 2 with Jody Madera, 1 with Naomi Kahn, and I have no idea whether they approve of any of this. What I'm presenting today is mine. The other thing is that some of this was developed for a conference on hospital antitrust. I know nothing about antitrust. I'm going off on a limb. And finally, I'm going to channel Elta's talk of yesterday and say I have long, ever since my association with this field, been frustrated by the perspective of law and bioethics, which in my mind tries to see things that have already are on the market and try to say, should we use them? And I am much more interested in the forces that I think determine what we develop. And that's what this talk is about today. So it's taking a look at the business picture of fertility clinics. And I start with what I call the standard picture, the Wild West of medicine, medical capitalism, the fact that there is limited regulation, few third-party payers, and the biggest competition is for success rates. But as Judy Darr has long emphasized, this is not a fully accurate picture. The more accurate picture is that there's really something like cartel-like pricing. That is, about 73% of fertility clinics are small, decentralized, but individual consumers have no market power and really don't engage in that much price shopping. There's some, it gets disproportionate attention in the law reviews, but it's not all that common or effective. And there are, in fact, high barriers to entry, which means that it is not truly a competitive market. Note, it is really expensive and time-consuming to become a reproductive endocrinologist. So even though there's increasing demand and high prices, it's not that easy to flood the market with low-cost products. And so what that means, practically, is that you have in most jurisdictions, that is most locales, a small number of providers who provide a high-cost product without a whole lot of price competition. But that's changing. The single biggest factor that changes it is increased insurance coverage. So Deborah Spar talked a lot about this a lot in her book, The Baby Business. And if you look at what happens when insurance comes into a market, there are more patients who can afford to pay and greater demand. But it is the insurance companies who are the repeat players. They put pressure on price and cap reimbursement rates. When that happens, the business model favors greater volume. And what I want to talk about primarily is what happens when that occurs. Because if you have larger clinics, they then become platforms for leveraging legal and price differences across jurisdictions. And let me comment before I go on what's happening on the insurance front. Well, there's 15 states that mandate at least some IVF coverage, but the bigger changes are coming from insurance companies rather than from a change in the laws. So insurance already covers some parts of fertility treatments, the diagnosis and treatment of illnesses and pregnancy and childbirth. But note, as we learn more about causes of infertility, there are more cases that fit into a medical model with some insurance coverage. Endometriosis is the simplest, but there are other things coming down the pike, including relationships to obesity. When you look at businesses, 65% of businesses with more than 500 employees pay for an initial evaluation by a fertility specialist. 27% of plans nationally cover in vitro fertilization to some degree. 41% of large employers cover drug therapies associated with fertility treatments, which are often an expensive component. So insurance coverage tends to promote greater size and an emphasis on more routine kinds of things. The other thing going on are the forces that have produced consolidation in the medical field generally. So if you follow hospitals, they've gotten bigger. Hospital antitrust recently reinvigorated. And some of those things also affect fertility clinics. Most notably, Electronic Records Acts and privacy compliance increase costs, but also increase returns to scale. Same thing is true if you're involved in negotiations with drug companies for volume discounts, financing new equipment and lab maintenance in a rapidly changing field, advertising new patient acquisition, desire, and all of this combines producing a desire for increased geographic reach. Now, there are two things that can happen. You can use IntegraMed, that is, you can have brokers who help with things where there are returns to scale, or there can be consolidation. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you have larger platforms, they become vehicles for shopping across jurisdictions, matching different kinds of patients. So this slide is taken from the website of the Fertility Institutes, which advertises itself as present in the United States, Mexico, and India. And what does it advertise? Gender selection. This is illegal in a large part of the world, but not in most of the US. Affordable gender selection programs. You can go to Mexico and do it if you can't afford IVF in the United States. The world's only fully integrated gay surrogacy program, again, which helps gay couples find surrogates, designed to appeal to gay men from countries that would ban this, and then matches them various places around the world, depending on cultural differences and affordability. And when it talks about international programs, how it works with clinics in 42 countries, what it's saying is basically, can't afford it in the US, we'll send you to Mexico. You're already in somewhere, Latin America, the Middle East, we'll bring you to the US. So the elite of the world are coming here, and especially to California, for things like surrogacy, while the US is busy, and often US clinics are busy, sending patients who have run out of money someplace that is less expensive. So this is simply the summary. Already mentioned it. Fertility treatments, again, we're seeing greater cross-border travel. This summarizes what I just said. Now, I want to talk about two areas where this changes some of what we're seeing. And I'm picking two. I could spend the rest of the day on this. One is the picture of innovation. So the old picture, well, we didn't have a whole lot of no federal funding, not much private funding, so you just do it. So St. Barnabas in the 90s wanted to experiment with parent IVF. You don't do a whole lot of pre-testing. You just do it, see what happens, see if it works, and find out later if there are any problems. But the FDA put an end to that by a certain jurisdiction, which means pre-approval, which it's not going to do without testing, which is expensive. And so the issue is, how do we get around it? I like to talk about Biosciences, which I find absolutely amazing. So Biosciences is a Boston company. There was some work done around 2011 indicating that women's ovaries have egg precursor cells which might be coaxed into developing mature eggs, and presumably at all kinds of ages. And new young eggs, not simply new eggs of the eggs at the age of the woman from whom these cells are taken. So Biosciences decided, well, let's commercialize this. They have an initial venture capital funding and a publicly traded company. Their idea is that the game changer would be the development of eggs from these egg precursor cells, which are basically egg stem cells. And if they were to do that, genetic screening, you could do it to decide which eggs to implant or use, or which embryos that develop from the eggs become routine. It would look a whole lot like Hank's book if this really worked. But what they are doing is going immediately to market with something they call Augment, which takes these egg precursor cells from the woman's ovaries, develops them to the point where they can extract mitochondria, adds the mitochondria to a woman's existing eggs, and hopes for a boost, increasing the efficacy of IVF. Note, there is no third-party donor. These cells come from the woman's own body. Do we know whether it works? Let's try it. So the first baby was born doing this in Toronto. But the FDA has said you can't do it in the US without testing, so it's not being done here. Biosciences simply goes ahead and tries it. And when it worked, when you have the first child born, then it is pitching to its donors. This will be a good idea. We will have 1,000 babies a year. Stock price booms. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And now they're under a lot of pressure to sign up fertility clinics. They look at Japan, the Middle East, Canada. And the idea is we're going to boost the efficacy of aging eggs that somehow don't result in reproduction, but without necessarily a known problem. You also have what's going on with free parent IVF. I'm not going to go into the details, but it uses a similar model. You just do it. First one was done in Mexico. New Hope, a fertility clinic in the US, is involved with it. They do it in Mexico because no regulations. So you have a growing market. You have a combination of public and private financing. You have the ability to do it abroad. What can go wrong? This is what Biosciences' share price looks like. Again, it's in trouble right now. And the MIT Review did something in December questioning whether this isn't just like these Laetrile or stem cell treatments in Mexico. We don't know whether it works. And so there's now a securities suit filed. There are a lot of issues. The stock market, you can see, has reacted. The second thing I want to talk about is surrogacy, and then I'm going to tie this together at the end. This is what gestational surrogacy laws look like by state, high degree of variation, but clearly authorized in California. This is what's been happening. Gestational carrier cycles as a percentage of all IVF have been increasing, even though it's only a total of 2.5%. This is the international cycle. So you can see it was about 10% of US cycles in 1999. Dips when India and Thailand come online. They've since tightened up. So the number of foreign residents coming to the US for surrogacy has been increasing as a percentage of the total, and is in 2013 was 20%. What can go wrong? This is the recent California case. You have a 47-year-old California surrogate who had done this multiple times before. The dad is 50-year-old, deaf, postal worker, living with his parents in Georgia. She is pregnant with triplets. He wanted selective reduction. She refused, saying she doesn't believe in abortion. She then went public trying to prevent the abortion, had the triplets, but under California law, he is clearly the father, whisked them away, living happily, as far as we know, in Georgia, and lots of lawsuits to file. This violates all the rules of ordinary practice of agencies. You shouldn't be using a 47-year-old who has already done this multiple times. No need to implant the 3. This is use donor eggs from a young woman. There is legal representation, but it doesn't appear the lawyers ever explained to her she agreed to an abortion. She didn't seem to approve much of the dad. They had never met, but it's not clear she should be screening. And so you have a variety of issues that were red flags where the agency could have done things to at least make sure they're on the same page, but didn't. Here is my conclusion as I wrap up, is when you look at the business model projected into the future, you've got economies of scale. You've got a variety of new entrants like the fertility institutes who note the comparison to Uber, large insurers assembling networks. Prediction, this is from Forbes, that IVF will move to a big purchaser, big provider model. And my conclusion is, how do we lock in and regulate? Big entities are more vulnerable, both to market pressure and regulation. And I've been suggesting a series of things. I'll give you only one as an example. The UK is upset about all of this, people coming back from abroad with babies. I've suggested, why not? A good housekeeping seal of approval if they simply said, we will identify agencies who accept our principles, but they got to allow some payment. That if they had an approved list, we will recognize parentage up front. You could do that. But the really big issue in my mind is professionals. doctors and lawyers, when I teach my students how to draft for surrogacy agreements, my emphasis is on a true meeting of the minds, not merely provisions you stick in small print to protect your client when there's later litigation. I'll stop there. John Robertson from Texas.
Great paper. Just two questions. Obviously, with the bigger model, integrated model, the quality is better, just as we want.
Yes.
We're getting a complex surgery to go to the centers that are in a lot. So here's that trade-off there. And on the second point about surrogacy, my sense is that the story you tell there is an outlier. That the general sense is that most surrogacy agreements work out fine. Of course, we don't have the data. Alton was talking about this in the first day. It would help to have a lot of data about what's going on, and whether to confirm that. And then finally, would not the Uniform Parentage Act adopted in Texas, Virginia, other places, which have a hearing before a judge before the surrogacy agreement and transfer is entered into, that does various quality control mechanisms, full consent, et cetera, would not that model take care of most of the concerns we have with surrogacy that is carried out?
Okay. So my answer is yes, yes, and yes, but let me elaborate a little bit. The first one, if you have larger entities, do you have better quality control? Yes, and indeed one of the advantages of this is you often see large entities, the New Hope, for example, arranging for the 3-parent IVF birth in Mexico, is not only exercising in fact some quality control, but it has very important reasons to do so. So yes, this becomes a source of policing. On agencies, what about surrogacy agencies? Isn't this case of surrogacy gone wrong an outlier? And I put on the bottom here, evil agency. Yes, because, and I think that's exactly the point. This is a not entirely reputable agency, and I don't know enough about the background to know why he ended up there. My hunch is more reputable agencies were unwilling to take him, or he couldn't afford them. And that, so one of the issues, the hard issue becomes, how do you ensure the reputability of the agencies, who tend to be harder to police than doctors who can lose their licenses? And I was a little bit too quick at the end saying we need to look at the professionals involved. I think the role of lawyers in policing the agreements is important. On Texas and the Uniform Parentage Act, the final point, I think that that process offers some advantages. You have screening beforehand before a court, but you have a lot of circumvention of it, both because it's expensive and because, at least in the old days, the refusal to approve gay and lesbian couples, for example, which creates a whole set of workarounds. And I think the cross-border issues, cross-jurisdictional issues are complex there. And so I'd like to see more of a question, how do we put pressure on the professionals who arrange this to get some lock-in to ethical principles? Mm-hmm. Kim.
So June, I guess that sort of pushes me to have a question about lawyers policing these arrangements. So I'm from New Jersey, which public policy in New Jersey says we shouldn't be doing this. We have a huge fertility industry in New Jersey, and one of the things that I talk about with my students is, if you are a lawyer practicing in New Jersey, should you be doing these surrogacy contracts at all, right? Is it unethical for you to engage in this kind of work? And I know lawyers who won't do it in New Jersey, particularly for that reason. So I wonder, part of what's hard about being the lawyers who police is that the law is so shaky, right? And so how are we supposed to be policing in jurisdictions where, frankly, we shouldn't be doing it at all?
Yes, and I want to answer what I can answer, and then say that where you have a jurisdiction that simply doesn't recognize commercial surrogacy, I think the issues are much tougher. But if you take abortion, for example, I think lawyers are compelled to tell their clients that no judge is going to order an abortion. You can't get specific performance. There's some uncertainty about what happens to the payments if the gestational carrier refuses to go ahead. But I think where lawyers have an important role, and this is what I emphasize with my students, is Some commissioning couples believe in abortion, some don't. Some gestational carriers do and some don't. This gestational carrier would have aborted a child with birth defects, but not a healthy triplet. And simply knowing that in advance is useful, so I end with a story. I had somebody talk to my class who runs an agency. He had a couple come from Italy. The gestational carrier was pregnant with twins. He wanted, the couple wanted selective reduction. The gestational carrier was willing to go ahead with it. The guy who ran the agency was appalled as a violation of his ethical principles. So he wrote into all future contracts, no selective reduction of twins. Now, I'm not taking a position on that. I am simply saying I think lawyers do have an obligation to explain to their clients what they're agreeing to and to make sure they're on the same page. Thank you.
So I am actually going to try to talk quickly about 3 different technologies which promise to make the assisted reproductive technologies of the past look totally outdated. And the 3 technologies that I'm talking about are egg freezing, gametogenesis, and uterine transplants. So first, egg freezing. The cryopreservation of embryos, of course, has long been standard practice, but until recently, the freezing of unfertilized eggs was not possible. In 2012, however, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine issued a new guideline saying that egg freezing should no longer be considered experimental. Uterine transplants are, of course, not yet common, but several attempts were made without success until 2014, when Dr. Mats Brandström from Sweden led a Swedish team of physicians and announced the first birth of a baby born from a transplanted womb. Finally, gametogenesis. Although this technology is only in the experimental phases, researchers have already derived in vitro gametes from mice and succeeded in producing live offspring from them. So the research suggests that the derivation of functional gametes from human stem cells may one day be possible. So what should we think about these 3 types of technologies? It seems to me that all 3 of them seem to offer the promise of liberating individuals, single women, gay and lesbian couples, and infertile people from the limits of biology by supplying them with frozen or synthetic gametes and transplanted uteruses so that they can have children who are the products of their own genes and gestation. Egg freezing, for example, allows young women to freeze their own ova for future use, permitting them to postpone reproduction to a time when it fits in when there are other goals and aspirations, while at the same time releasing them from reliance upon egg donors. Similarly, uterine transplants offer women who lack a functioning uterus, suffer from uterine factor infertility, the opportunity to gestate their own children. And of course, this simultaneously frees them from the need to hire a gestational surrogate while also allowing them to experience some of the physical aspects of pregnancy. Of the 3 technologies, gametogenesis appears the most radical because it could enable couples potentially of the same sex to have their own genetically connected offspring, just as opposite sex couples can currently do. And it would also render sperm and egg donors superfluous by enabling infertile persons and couples of the same sex to generate their own personalized gametes so that they could produce their own genetic children. It could also be used, and this has been suggested, to create a number of additional gametes so that those who want to engage in genetic selection would have a wider array of embryos to choose from, because of course currently we're limited by the limited number of ova, but if you could create an unlimited supply of ova, then potentially you could have a much broader range of embryos. So there are also genetic selection possibilities and kind of the end of sex that Hank predicts that go along with or accompany gametogenesis. So all 3 of these technologies, it seems, should be celebrated to the extent that they liberate people from the limits of biology and empower people to have their own genetic children. But at the same time, I think no, let's talk first about the liberation aspect. They provide individuals with the ability to keep reproduction, quote, all in the family, if you will, without involving third parties. And this seems to deftly sidestep a number of the ethical, legal, and social concerns that are raised by earlier forms of assisted reproduction. If you don't have a need to purchase gametes and gestational services on the markets from third parties, then you can exclude strangers from the relationship created by the ART form family, and this enables individuals to prevent the inclusion of strangers who might become entangled in relationships. It also raises fears prevents the individuals from being able to assert claims to the resulting children. And it also alleviates the concern for fears about commodification, exploitation, and other intrusion of market elements into the ART process that have raised so many concerns about vulnerable individuals suffering from lack of informed consent and the exploitation of vulnerable parties. So it seems as if it promises really a way out of a lot of the earlier dilemmas regarding surrogacy and gamete donors. For this reason, one of the physicians who's engaging in uterine transplant at the Cleveland Clinic has remarked, Dr. Andreas Sakis of the Cleveland Clinic, he suggests that uterus transplantation is, quote, ethically superior to surrogacy because surrogacy, quote, creates a class of people who rent their uterus, rent their body for reproduction, he says. It has some gravity. It possibly exploits poor women. And the idea is that if we could engage in uterine transplant instead of surrogacy, this might be ethically superior. So that's the bright side of these new technologies. But I fear that there are also potential problems raised by each of these. And I would like to start with egg freezing. First of all, egg freezing may indeed actually offer women false hopes. Indeed, when the American Society of Reproductive Medicine removed the experimental label from egg freezing in 2012, it suggested that the technique should actually be confined to women facing infertility due to chemotherapy. And it cautioned that marketing this technology for the purpose of deferring childbearing may actually give women false hope and encourage women to delay childbearing. Despite these warnings, egg freezing is being touted as the latest technological fix to the ticking biological clock, a form of fertility insurance. In fact, some companies are calling it eggsurance that enables women to avoid or delay, that enables women to delay childbearing. And this fact is not necessarily assured that they can actually use their eggs. So the egg freezing process, in fact, comes with a high price tag. One cycle of egg freezing, including the hormonal treatment to induce egg production, costs around $10,000. And women may require multiple egg freezing cycles in order to collect enough eggs for several successful pregnancies. In addition, most fertility centers are charging an annual storage fee for the eggs once they're frozen, which is usually around $500 a year. And the costs of IVF, which you'd have to add on top of this, may be $5,000 for each attempt. So if you add it all up, the costs of egg freezing could be very substantial when you're thinking about freezing your eggs and then saving them for all of those years and then subsequently engaging in IVF attempts. And it's not even clear that these procedures are going to be that effective. In spite of all these factors, companies like egg banks are advertising these expensive egg freezing procedures to women and even hosting parties, egg freezing parties, with cute little labels such as "Let's Chill" in places like New York and Los Angeles. So I think egg freezing itself is an expensive, invasive technique that carries real health risks to women that may not be worth the trade-off. But there's an even greater threat that's posed by the technique of egg freezing than merely creating false hopes and luring women into undergoing expensive and invasive procedures. And this is the danger that what is technologically possible often becomes normalized, routinized, and even subtly or not so subtly imposed. For example, a number of local companies right here, Apple and Facebook, have provoked controversy by offering to pay for their workers, egg freezing services for their employees. And this is an action that at once appears to free women to work longer hours while at the same time subtly pressuring them to postpone childbearing. So do such options actually enhance autonomy of women, or do they actually help to undermine true gender equality? So I think there are subtle and not so subtle ways in which you can view these developments as resulting in new forms of oppression and exploitation, instead of trying to transform workplace conditions that make it really difficult for everyone to manage all of the competing concerns about career, family. This seems to offer a technological fix to a broader social problem that really privatizes the problem and undermines the attempt fundamentally to achieve better social solutions. Along the same lines, you can view each of the technologies as a scientific fix to circumvent the ethical, legal, and social problems posed by previous, while at the same time creating new ethical, legal, and social problems. With respect to uterine transplantation specifically, the first reported transplant was performed in Saudi Arabia in 2000, and unfortunately it failed. And the second transplant didn't occur until 2011 in Turkey, when it also failed. It wasn't until 2012 in Sweden that you had the first successful transplant. The Swedish team has actually transplanted uteri, from live donors into 9 women with absolute uterine factor infertility. All but one of the donors were the mother or a close relative of the recipient, the maternal aunt, the sister, or the mother-in-law. The researchers reported that the donor surgeries ranged from 10 to 13 hours, and the recipient surgeries ranged from 4 to 6 hours. So we're talking about incredibly invasive and dangerous surgeries upon a woman who's donating a uterus, a live donor, in order to provide another woman with a transplanted uterus. And to date, I think there have been at least 14 uterine transplant surgeries internationally, but there have only been 5 live births. So this move from a relatively low-tech to a high-tech procedure is, in a way, attempts to circumvent problems, but raises its own problems. I think that it's not clear that uterine transplants are actually superior to surrogacy. And the fact that they are altruistic doesn't mean they are any more voluntary or less coercive or exploitative. Indeed, familial pressures upon a mother or a sister to donate a uterus may render them even more coercive than surrogacy contracts that involve arm's-length transactions with strangers. And I think that faced with a choice, many women might actually prefer to serve as gestational surrogates than to donate a uterus. Lastly, gametogenesis, in the 1 minute I have, seems to empower same-sex couples to have genetic children the same way as heterosexual couples. But you could argue that the employment of gamete donors and gestational surrogates furthered the radical uncoupling of assisted reproductive technology form families from the dominant ideology of the natural biological family. And it showed that biological connections were neither necessary nor sufficient to confer parental status. And this process arguably helped to forge new definitions of collaborative and intent-based parenthood, which may in turn have contributed to the movement for marriage equality. Gametogenesis, on the other hand, arguably empowers same-sex couples to have their own genetic children in exactly the same way as heterosexual couples, reifying and enshrining the importance of biology. Instead of challenging heteronormativity, it actually enshrines it. So as a consequence, I think you could argue that although these technologies appear to liberate individuals and promise to forge new configurations of family, Ultimately, they may reinforce and perpetuate what's a very conservative vision of family, which places undue emphasis on genetic ties and biological kinship. Thank you. So, Hank.
First, just to reassure everyone who might not know about my book, I actually predict that people will keep having sex. They just won't have sex for the purpose of conceiving children nearly as often. And any pun you have to explain is by definition a bad pun, but the end of sex is also the purpose, the reason for, etc. sex. But my question, every time I think I've thought of every weird thing involved in assisted reproductive technologies, another thought intrudes. Has anybody talked about uterine transplants into biological males?
Yes, actually, it's a great question, and one of the suggestions is being made that that uterine transplants may be advocated for transsex individuals. So how do you, and so I've been actually trying to explore this question as part of this paper, because one of the difficulties, Brandstrom in Sweden is taking people who suffer from uterine factor infertility, and I think lack part of a functioning uterus. Arguably, under some definitions, those people could be deemed transsexual, but they're women. I mean, they consider themselves to be women, but you know, so if you're taking people who have, who lack a functioning uterus, then you know, are they male? Are they transsexual? How do you define that? So I think in a way, even the current technology as it's being used, arguably is being used for people who are at the very least trans. Yeah. June? Yes.
And view this as acceptable.
And I think that's why it's been pioneered in Saudi Arabia, you know, was the first attempt, Turkey, and then Sweden. I think they're very wary of surrogacy. So that's why these arguments are being made that this is ethically superior, or it provides a method of reproduction for people who religiously have objections to surrogacy. And I don't know how you deal with the religious questions, but it seems to me if your concern is coercion or exploitation, and then you're seeking uterine transplant as superior, but it actually could be viewed as more coercive, more exploitative, and more dangerous, then I don't really feel like that works to circumvent the earlier objections. What do you do with the problem of religious objections? I'm not sure.
Time for a question but no answer. Pick somebody for their question.
A question but no answer. Okay, Sonia?
So the last point you made about IVG and sort of the challenge of what constitutes a family is something I struggled with in my piece on IVG. One thing that really struck me is after the piece came out, I got a number of emails from individuals who seemed to think I was actually doing the IVG research, and they asked me if they could be involved in those trials. So I think there is going to be a huge demand for that, and I think there's a real tension here between saying, oh, you're looking too much like heteronormative, you know, you're challenging these norms, we're not going to let you, right? I mean, I'm not saying you're saying prohibit it, but there's a real tension there when there's, I think, going to be a real demand for that.
And those people, I'm just curious as to who the people are. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm taking us to the future. Radhika just mentioned briefly using in vitro gametogenesis for embryo selection. And so I'm going to take us to Hank's future with easy pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. This project started, the idea started formulating when I wrote a book review of Hank's excellent book. And it's true, he does acknowledge that sex will continue, but that people will, for some people. But his theory is that the majority of people, or at least many people, will rely on easy PGD to reproduce. And my argument is essentially twofold, that easy PGD will present paralyzing choices for individuals, and that the remedies that providers, commercial entities, or the state might offer could create their own sets of challenges. So by way of background, let me briefly tell you what the technology might look like. It would start with in vitro gametogenesis, which Radhika explained would be the derivation of cells from gametes, ova or sperm from somebody's somatic cells, and it would avoid the physical difficulties or challenges of retrieving eggs, and would allow for the possibility to create an unlimited number of ova. This large supply of ova could then be fertilized through in vitro fertilization, leading to potentially tens, hundreds, or even thousands of embryos. PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, could then be performed on these embryos using whole genome sequencing, because we're now in the future, so this will be part of the testing, creating a genomic profile that would tell you a lot of information about each of the embryos. And then based on that genomic profile, the parents would select the embryos for implantation. Now I'm accepting Hank's prediction that this technology will one day become technologically and financially feasible. Obviously, there are a lot of technical challenges before this happens, so we're in the future right now. The point of this would be to offer much more robust embryo selection. But my theory is, while it would offer those options for more choices, that there would be so many choices that it could be paralyzing. The first problem would just be information overload and comprehension challenges. But then there are two particular choices people would have to make that would be challenging. The first would be, what information do I want to get about embryos to make these choices? And then the second one is, once I get all that information, how do I choose among my tens, hundreds, or thousands of embryos? So I'm going to be a little bit brief about the information challenges because they're much like the challenges we face when we think about whole genome sequencing generally. People would need to understand that the kind of information you could obtain would really vary in lots of ways. They don't have to understand that it would give you information about different ages of onset, differences in severity, differences in whether treatment was available, probability of conditions manifesting. And then trait information might also vary in terms of non-medical trait information, might also vary in terms of its probabilities. Now, if you focus on the choice issues, the first choice would be, what information would people want to get about the embryos? And so the question would be, what information is relevant for embryo selection? Now, unlike with prenatal testing, there's no existing pregnancy. There's no question about, would this information be relevant to a decision to continue a pregnancy or to consider putting the child up for adoption? So my theory is people would probably want a much broader range of information for embryo selection. Otherwise, why go to the trouble of using this technology? So they would probably not just want to know about serious medical conditions, but also about lesser medical conditions and potentially a lot of non-medical traits. So there'd be a lot to think about. You'd want enough information to make the choices meaningful, to actually take advantage of the technology, but not so much information that it would be overwhelming. So how do you decide what information you want? But the hardest choice would be choosing among this large quantity of embryos. So first, you just have to understand the information. You'd have a genome profile of each embryo. That's a lot of information multiplied by tens, hundreds, or thousands of embryos. And then you'd have to try to look at the relative benefits of the information. Which embryos, or which one or two embryos or three look the best, however that's defined. So to steal some versions from Hank's book, to make the choice a little bit more concrete, imagine that embryo 1, that its genomic profile shows that it has a higher than average risk of heart disease, colon cancer, and type 1 diabetes, but a lower than average risk of schizophrenia, breast and ovarian cancer, and asthma. In contrast, embryo 2 has a higher than average risk of bipolar disorder, cataracts, autism, and prostate cancer, and a lower than average risk of leukemia, Alzheimer's disease, gout, and pancreatic cancer. That's just the disease information. Now throw in information about the non-medical traits. So embryo 1, female, she'll experience early graying, will be moderately tall, heavy build. This is Hank's example. I love this one. 65% chance of having scores on the SATs in the top half. A good chance of above average athletic ability and likely to be introverted. Embryo 2 will be a male who will have male pattern balding, medium height, medium build, but only a 40% chance of having SAT scores in the top half, and a good chance of above average musical ability and likely to be anxious. Okay, so now try to pick between those two embryos. Yeah, right. I thought, take a vote of the group. But now imagine doing this for tens or hundreds of embryos. That's a pretty overwhelming choice. So that, I think, in itself presents some issues with easy PGD. But my theory is that 3 entities might get involved to try to make the choices less overwhelming: providers, the state, and commercial entities. So I'm going to skip over the remedies they may offer for the comprehension issues. People have talked about that in whole genome sequencing, the idea of kind of binning the information into categories. I want to focus on remedies for the choices. So the choice of deciding what information to obtain, one option would be either professional societies or the state to say, we're just going to limit how much information you get. It's just too much information for you, and so we'll limit what you get. Maybe there will be other concerns about things like the societal effects. Maybe there would be worries that people are relying too much on non-medical trait information. So maybe keep that information out. With respect to selecting the embryos, I thought about this with my Facebook feed. Things sort of pop up. I don't know why they pop up from this person and not that person. So it's the algorithms. And it seems to me that what people might offer are algorithms for decision making. You could offer individualized algorithms where people would input information about their particular values and preferences regarding different kinds of information. They could weight them accordingly. But I think a lot of people might find that pretty overwhelming. How do you rank the different kinds of information you could get? How do you choose among those things? So, and it's also very abstract. So what if generic algorithms were created? What if you created various kinds of algorithms that assigned points based on severity, age of onset, degree of impairment, certain kinds of traits that we really like, non-medical traits, other traits that we're not so keen on, and then discount that by the probabilities of the traits manifesting. So, what are the implications of these remedies? On the one hand, you could say, well, if we're trying to maximize choice and this helps people make choices, that's a good thing. It streamlines the decision-making process. But I think there are several reasons to be troubled by these remedies. The first is just the impact of algorithms generally on reproductive decision-making, particularly generic algorithms. So the first thing is that it could encourage the abdication of decision-making. Okay, this is too hard, just rely on the algorithm. It could also lead to the problem that I think Stephanie brought up with respect to algorithms, that there are hidden biases inherent in these algorithms that people may not really be aware of. And then finally, if generic algorithms were widely used, they could standardize reproductive decision-making in a way that we really haven't seen before. And so that routinization problem that June brought up, that Radhika talked about, would really, I think, be very different than routinization we see today. Now, if we focus on particular entities, they present their own sets of challenges. So imagine professional groups creating algorithms for decision-making. You could say that's the best group to do that. They have the most expertise about the genetics. They understand how people deal with reproductive decision-making. But it presents a number of issues. The first is that I think it challenges norms of the profession. It sort of minimizes the idea of individualized genetic testing. It deviates from the profession's attempted neutrality. It's a myth that the profession is completely neutral, but at least they attempt to be neutral. A generic algorithm would express particular preferences in very concrete ways. And it's also suggestive of the days when geneticists had a eugenic agenda in being involved in reproduction. But I think the worst thing is, again, Stephanie's point on algorithms, that it would medicalize and make objective the algorithms, the choices. And it would make it seem like, well, this is what the doctors are telling me to do. And I think it would make people feel like this is a good thing to follow because the physicians know best. They've offered these great algorithms. Now, when commercial entities get involved, the concern there is that market forces could influence the creation of the algorithms to sort of shape consumer demands, perhaps to make easy PGD more enticing. We've got this great generic algorithm that will help you pick children who are going to be super successful and very, very healthy. Now, if the state gets involved, that obviously raises constitutional as well as policy issues. So the first question would be, would this violate any reproductive rights associated with the 14th Amendment? And there'd really be a two-step process there. So the first question would be, do you have a right to procreate using technology like IVF and IVG? And many people in this room have written and thought about that question. So maybe, tentatively, you might have that right. But then you'd have to show that that right leads to a right to get information about the embryos. And at least one federal court has said that a right to abortion includes a right to get prenatal information. So a tentative claim could be made that there would be a right to do this. But then, of course, you'd have to look at the nature of the state action. So imagine that the state were to restrict access to certain kinds of information. That could potentially be an undue burden because it would limit the ability, it would create an obstacle in using EZPGD. But the state might assert a fairly strong state interest if it had concerns about trait selection. For example, non-medical trait selection, and we've seen the state consider societal effects in limiting reproductive rights in Gonzales. The First Amendment would obviously be implicated because the state would be restricting information, and it might not be content neutral, so there could be First Amendment issues. Now imagine that the state regulates the algorithms. It could either require the use of certain kinds of algorithms when people struggle to make decisions, or the state could prohibit the use of certain algorithms. Perhaps they're worried about generic algorithms that standardize or algorithms that focus on non-medical traits. That might not be an undue burden because individuals would be allowed other methods of choosing of choosing embryos. And Gonzales says you can limit one kind of abortion procedure when another one is available to you. And then finally, the policy issues. The first thing is it would just be problematic, I think, to have the state involved in reproductive decision-making in this way. It raises the aspect of the eugenics era that was most problematic, which was state involvement. Controlling which algorithms would be used to select embryos would be particularly egregious, maybe not quite as bad as compulsory sterilization, but because there wouldn't be the bodily integrity issues, but it would still be the state actively controlling procreation. And then finally, if the state were to restrict access or the use of certain information and algorithms, that would create problems because the state would be sanctioning certain kinds of selection and saying it was okay to discriminate on that basis, but not on other bases. So I will stop there in my future world. Jessica?
Hi. So this is taking a step back from the algorithm point, because when I was looking at your title, I thought that you were maybe going to talk a little bit about consumer psychology and the fact that paralyzing choices is an actual thing, that we actually don't want more choices in a lot of contexts.
Right.
So is there some role you think in your research here to say that maybe and I hate to call them consumers, right, the parents don't actually want the information?
Right. So that was something I was thinking about. What's driving what? So I was imagining at first, Hank's world where everybody's going to want to use this, and they're going to think it's great because they're going to want lots of information. And it's possible maybe that the marketing of it says, oh, we've got these great algorithms, so we're actually making all this choice seem less problematic. But yeah, so I think there is that tension, but I think when technology's there and when people know they can get more information about something, I think it's very hard for people to turn that down. We see that repeatedly when technologies are offered for getting information. So people might say in the abstract, yeah, I don't think I really want that. But then also when you think if all your neighbors in your Palo Alto competitive area, if some of the parents are picking the best embryos there with the 65% chance or higher on the SATs, why would you not do that? So I think there are lots of factors that could push people to want to choose more. So, Kim?
So I have a question about what the constitutional standard would be if these were subjected to review. And you seem to assume that it would be undue burden,
yeah.
which is like so sui generis in the context of,
Yeah.
of abortion. And I'm not sure why I wouldn't even concede, right? I mean, I would fight about what the standard is.
Yeah, no, that is a little bit fast and loose there, I think, and I do have a footnote where I say we don't know entirely what the standard would be, so you could say that's just abortion. And so, maybe a lesser standard of review. I think there's so many questions with respect to the constitutionality that are up for grabs because we don't even know if there would be a constitutional right in the first place, let alone what the standard of review. So I completely agree with you on that. Alta?
So I'm going to push back just a little bit on the need maybe to do more research on the empirical claims that are being made here. And Hank won't be insulted. He knows that I've talked to him before about my skepticism as
Just
widely.
get insulted again.
Yes. Because we have experience that shows us people didn't flock to certain things. They didn't flock to artificial insemination. They didn't flock to PGD, even when they could have in many contexts. And, there was evidence that a lot of people don't take advantage of prenatal screening, and they don't choose to find out
Right.
whether they're carrying the kid with Down. So it
Right.
may be really helpful in figuring out kind of what the societal effects are to really work hard to get better information about the kinds of things that people have been doing, and then try to prognosticate. Second thing, just very briefly on the government. The FDA, I know this when I did interviews with them back in the 80s, they spent over a decade before they ever regulated artificial insemination or the use of gametes, precisely because they couldn't figure out which genetic traits were so dangerous you should screen them out. So now you'll see they only recommend screening for infectious disease. I'd be surprised if the government ever got involved in this. More likely it's going to be like Zillow. You pump in, I want 4 bedrooms, and I want this neighborhood, and it'll give you like a selection of things, but it's not going to zero in on one.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was trying to sort of imagine all the potential actors. I think I could imagine the government maybe being worried about certain kinds of commercial entities getting involved and being involved in that way rather than every single thing that I pointed out to you. And on the first question about how likely it is that people are going to want to use this technology, I do think there's a big difference between PGD today, when you have to retrieve eggs, and this. So I think that changes it, but that doesn't answer your question fully. I think non-invasive prenatal testing, though, is one area where you see people are suddenly very, very interested in getting information. I mean, Jamie's done a lot of work on this that they weren't interested in. They didn't necessarily think they were interested in once you remove some of the barriers of the worries about the harm of the procedure and getting that information. But yeah, I mean, I'm speculating. This is the future, so I can create the world that I think will exist. Thank you.
I was not waiting for applause. I was waiting to get the signal. But thank you. Thank you anyway. So the title of my presentation today is The End of Natural Families. And when I sent it to Hank, I had a question mark on the end of it. And now I think I would have an exclamation point, right? So I wish that I had actually gone right after Radhika, because I think a lot of the issues that she was talking about, particularly in that last 1 minute, are issues that I want to flag now. So my work sits at the intersection of family law, health law, and bioethics. So the way I describe what I do is I use health law topics to think about the law's relationship to families, especially marginalized families. And my major focus is on assisted reproduction and its relationship to shifting family forms, family dynamics, and the legal regulation of families. I am also a big fan, as I'm sure many of people in this room are as well, of sci-fi, TV, and movies. And so what I wanted to do today was think about 2 shows in particular, Orphan Black and Humans, which all of you should be watching if you are not, and thinking about what they say about families and particularly about genetics and family. So let me put my cards on the table right away, which is that the end of natural families for me is not a lament or a cry for action. I actually think that's the direction that we should be moving in, and I think there are lots of positives that come from that. And why is that? My premise basically is that so-called natural families have really served their purpose, that we'd be better off as a society and as a world if we moved away from this sort of tyranny of nature and genes and started to think in a much more fluid way about kinship. Anthropologists have been complicating our notions of kinship for decades, and yet the law, unsurprisingly, continues to be very slow to catch up to what other people know. And our basic premises about what matters and what doesn't when it comes to family have been more static than I think they should be. And part of why the law shifts slowly is because it remains so deeply rooted in reproductive hierarchies. So the idea that there are some people who procreate and that gets valorized, and there are some people who procreate and that gets vilified. So the way I tend to describe this is, if you're upper middle class and white and you have babies, you get a tax break. If you're low income and black, you get a welfare cap, right? So my work is very much about dismantling reproductive hierarchies, in part because we have such a rich history, and this is not a good thing, in this country of abusing access to procreation. So whether it's sterilization abuse or eugenics or anti-miscegenation laws, all of those things have been used by our government to discourage or forbid procreation and parenting by people who are thought unworthy of having access to those things. And reproductive hierarchies obviously have been present in coital reproduction for a very long time, and unsurprisingly, they've been replicated in the context of assisted reproduction as well. And to the extent that assisted reproduction replicates these reproductive hierarchies, it does so in large part because it continues to position genetic ties between parents and children as paramount, and everything else is sort of second string. Right? If you can make your own babies, that's what you should try to do. If you can't do that, then you should settle for these other little things that you might be able to make. So I think that toppling the primacy of genetics from the top of the reproductive hierarchy is a really worthy goal. And I'll explain why in a few minutes, but first, why do I want to talk about orphan black and humans, besides the fact that, again, we should all be watching these shows. I think they both really reflect this sort of relationship to genetics that I'm talking about. So Orphan Black, for those of you who have not watched the show, has tons and tons of twists and turns, but the basic premise is that there's this young woman named Sarah, and she discovers that she is a clone, and that there are multiple versions of her that exist in the world in a genetic sense. And she eventually becomes acquainted with a whole series of them. The actress who plays the role is absolutely amazing. She plays the 8, 9, different versions of these clones, and she's really terrific. And Sarah, as she meets these women, immediately becomes attached to them. They form this very, very strong alliance and this sisterhood. They call each other sisters, even though for the first 20 plus years of their lives, they were all strangers and had no idea that each other existed. But they meet, and suddenly they have this deep and abiding loyalty to each other that's built almost exclusively on the fact that they share a genetic tie. And also, no doubt, on the experience of discovering that they're part of a massive and illegal human experiment, right? But putting that aside, yeah, that brings people together. So there's a lot to talk about in the show, but one of the issues that regularly leaves me perplexed is this immediate sense of kinship that these women feel for each other. I literally find it baffling, which probably says something important about me. But I've always wanted to see a scene in the show where someone finds out that she's a clone and completely rejects the idea of sisterhood, right? That clone, I would imagine, would ask herself, why should she upend her life and decide to bond with these people who share the accident of genetic identity, but literally nothing more? And the tension between genetic family and what I would consider in this context to be real family gets played out in conflicts between Sarah and her foster brother, Felix, who she was raised with, to whom she is extremely close and with whom she grew up. And Felix is often the voice of reason who challenges and questions Sarah's loyalty to her sisters and her willingness to risk her life for these veritable strangers who happen to share her face. But the show seems to be constructed around the narrative that this connection between these women is both natural and right, and that's an idea, frankly, that I reject. So let me talk about humans then. Also, lots of twists and turns. The story here centers around the idea of a world in which there are synthetic human beings who are basically super high-tech, realistic-looking robots, and they're used for a variety of tasks, from maids, caretakers, mechanics, gardeners, factory workers, all this fun stuff. Unsurprisingly, sex workers, right? Because that's really why we would want robots. And someone, of course, figures out how to program consciousness into the synths and creates a group of 5 of them, one of whom is actually part human, who are conscious, meaning that they are capable of interactions and thought processes that mirror what we do as human beings. And these 5 also consider themselves to be a family, just as Sarah and her sisters consider themselves to be a family. They call each other siblings, they have fierce loyalty to each other, but their connection to me actually feels deeper and more understandable than the connection in Orphan Black, which I find to be fundamentally superficial. The synths were raised together in the sense that they were created and brought up in the same household, and in fact, were largely isolated from other people and synths because they had consciousness, and synths aren't supposed to be conscious. And they're bound to each other because they share the same creator, which I guess we could think of as a form of parenthood, but there's no genetic tie between them in the way that we think biology should count when it comes to kin and relationships. Their ties are strictly affectional, not genetic, but they're lasting and they're strong in exactly the way that we supposedly want family ties to be. But their family doesn't look like a typical family, in large part because the synths are of different races. 2 of them are black, 1 is Asian, and 2 are white, which in the real world, as people who live in biracial or interracial families will tell you, would immediately lead people to question their claim to familial ties based on nothing more than the fact that they don't look like each other, which, when you think about it, is a pretty silly way to gauge whether people are family. So in thinking about families of the future, Orphan Black, for me, reinforces this sort of hegemonic view of kinship that relies on genetic connection, which is part of, but not only part of, why I find its premise to be troubling. And there's nothing really new here, right? People have been talking about this for a long time, but our emphasis on genes often doesn't serve people well. So if we de-romanticize genes, as Alta was talking about yesterday, my hope is that it will inexorably lead us to de-romanticize the family as well, because our romanticized notions of family are flat and they lack nuance. We demand that, oh, see, your timer's off. Your timer's off. I've got 6 minutes, 39 seconds on mine. All right. We demand that people feel connections that they might not feel. We demand that people take on responsibilities that they don't want to bear. We seek to force relationship in ways that can actually act to a person's detriment, and all because of shared DNA and accidents of life over which we have exercised literally no control. In some instances, it is empowering and important for people to walk away from genetic kinship for their own benefit. And in some instances, it's empowering and important for people to recognize that the fact that someone who shares their genes doesn't love or care for them doesn't reflect on their own worth. And I say all of this while obviously recognizing that, especially for marginalized families, genetic tie can be shield and sword. So think, for instance, about custody disputes between same-sex couples, where having or not having a genetic tie to a child ends up being a really critical issue. But in the end, I'm unconvinced that this model of reproductive hierarchy, in which genetic consanguinity is at the top, is either sustainable or desirable. So I'm much more interested in a human's world, one in which family is fluid and malleable, maybe tenuous on some occasions, but no more so, I think, than is true when it's premised on simple genetics and biology. Now, obviously, we're slowly shifting toward more open models, and marginalized families are certainly on the forefront of much of that movement. And here, assisted reproduction plays this oddly dichotomous role in that shift, because it both reinforces and rejects our ways of fetishizing genes. So on one hand, lots of people use assisted reproduction so that they can have the children who they would have had if they were not infertile, right? So that's what we often will see opposite-sex couples doing. But then there are all of these people who use assisted reproduction in ways that upend genetic tie. And I think that those uses of technology should be as deeply celebrated as those that mimic the outcome of coital reproduction. So for instance, people who use art and who either buy eggs or sperm, I don't use the word donors, right, because these people are not donating, really helps us to disengage in some ways from the idea that it's all about what's in our genes. And forcing genes to the background is frankly what allowed us to embrace the idea of intentional parenthood, which I think has been incredibly important in family law, particularly for same-sex couples, but for others as well. And it's not just parenthood that is intentional. People create whole structures of family life that are built on love, commitment, obligation, and responsibility, and not biology or genes. And frankly, one thing genetic testing should do for all of us is allow us to see that our genes aren't all that impressive, right? I mean, there are lots of us who, if we really thought about it, should decide that our genes should end up on the trash heap of the future instead of perpetuating them going forward. But getting people to walk away from genetic connection is obviously going to take a lot of work. And I think we should put in that work, because knocking genetic connection from the top of the reproductive hierarchy could have numerous potential benefits, and I'll just throw out some of them. One, frankly, I think it would help some people to remain childless who don't actually want children, but who are dragged into the experience by societal expectations of what and who we are and what makes for a good life. It would allow people to walk away from families of origin that do not serve their best interest. It would allow law and courts to fashion more fluid families, such as those who have 3, 4, 5, or 6 parents, parents who have no genetic connection to a particular child, but for someone for whom they wish to assume rights and responsibilities. It would also center adoption more as more than just a second or third best choice for those who can't have children of their own, which is just code for children who share one's genes. And it allows and encourages people to pursue parenthood instead of replication. So obviously I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not Hank, right? I cannot predict 40 years into the future what it's all going to look like.
You just can't necessarily be right.
There you go. Exactly. But I'll tell you what future I'd like to see. I'd like to see a future in which assisted reproduction ceases to be a tool for reinforcing static notions of kin and connectedness mired in the simplistic idea of how babies are made. My interest in reproductive technology is technology as disruption. And in this realm, disruption means troubling the waters of relatedness and again, decentering genes as the pinnacle of familial connection. And the opportunity to disrupt in this field gets wasted when we use this technology not to advance our sense of what it means to procreate, but to remind people that if they're not making kin that share their genes, that somehow they're doing it all wrong. So how we make connections as human beings, and in the future as synthetic human beings, should not be thought to rely on who shares our face, but on the people, children, or other adults for whom we willingly take on care and responsibility, which to me is the real cornerstone of what a family should be.
Oh, so I'm just curious what you make of these donor-sibling registries, right? Because the folks that participate in them seem to speak very warmly about them. So the parents who have received the purchased gametes, right, seem to say, like, oh, this gives my child a sense of feeling of connectedness, and then the donor siblings, do refer to each other as, my donor sibling, and they seem to have these, and I'm speaking from only watching made-for-TV documentaries.
Yes.
But they seem to have these warm connections. So how does that fit into your narrative, do you think? We want them to have these connections, but that's just not the be-all, end-all of their experience. They should also...
Yeah, I think that's right? I mean, so I'm sort of fascinated by the donor sibling registries. There's a part of me that sort of thinks that some piece of what is going on there is kids who are sort of being told there's this piece of you that's missing and you need to find it. And I think that's a really dangerous message, frankly, to send to people for a whole range of different reasons. You don't know what that connection is going to be. Is it going to be a good connection? Is it going to be a bad connection? Is it one you're going to regret making, right? These are really sort of difficult kinds of questions. And I don't think that anyone should feel obligated to want to have those relationships, right? The fact that you share genes with somebody doesn't make them someone you necessarily like or want to spend time with. So I would just be sort of cautious about how we pitch the importance of things like the donor sibling registry. Certainly I wouldn't shut it down and say you shouldn't know those people, but be thoughtful about why you're pursuing that. Yes, ma'am.
This is really interesting, and I promise I'm going to go home and watch Orphan Black.
Yeah, it's really good.
So I wonder if it's intentional or if it is something else that drives this genetic familiarity. And the reason I'm thinking about this is there's some data out there that I've read that says the incidence of stepfathers killing children under the age of 3 is astronomically higher than natural fathers doing this. Is that and the theory, of course, from some evolutionary biologists is that, get rid of that one and get your own kid in place as the primary child.
Mm-hmm.
All heard. Is that genetically driven? Is that socially driven? What are your thoughts on that, if in fact that's actually it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's obviously a sort of complicated question to think about. I mean, on one hand, I think that there are lots of ways in which families fracture and families fall apart, and it's sort of hard to figure out what might be going on in any given instance where there's violence in a particular family. So I think it's really hard for me to speak to that. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some level at which people feel drawn to somebody who shares their genes, right? I mean, that's not necessarily surprising to me because that's the way that we have structured our entire world. And there are lots of ways in which things that feel natural to us, we work very hard to reject. Right? And we say, well, we don't like this. We don't think, the fact that somebody pisses me off and my anger, gets piqued doesn't mean I get to just jump all over you and kill you, right? Even if that's what I sort of feel would be my natural response. I don't normally feel that way, by the way, right? Right. So I think that there are ways in which we are so bound to this idea of, well, that's just how we're built. And yet there are lots of ways in which we dismantle how we're built in order to be better versions of ourselves. Sure, over here.
In the spirit of hammers looking for nails.
Yeah.
One of the aspects of Orphan Black that you didn't really touch on, but I'd be very interested in because I think it interacts, is the patent game.
Yeah.
And one of the things that unifies these, they're all patent, but they actually haven't done much with that narrative line.
That's right.
I'm thinking that probably that has this feeling of joint exploitation or something.
Yeah. So one of the, and I realize I've been very bad and have not repeated a single question that was asked of me. But one of the pieces of Orphan Black is this idea that that these women are property of the company that engaged in this massive human experiment, which of course is totally false, right? You couldn't own people in the way that they talk about in the show, but that's how fiction works. So yes, I do think there's that sense of bonding. That's just the sort of bonding of here's this huge mystery in our lives, and we have all been treated as property in this very disturbing way, and we want to sort of find out what's going on there. I definitely think that that's a significant part of what drives the narrative of the show. But there's also this again, what I think is this very strange sense of, well, here's this person who looks exactly like me, so we should be best buddies, right? I might actually run from such a person, but there is this very sense that that what they feel for each other is exactly what they should, even though their provenance is so unnatural, right? But that bonding should be natural.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, thanks so much for the conference. It's been great being here. And so let me keep the ball rolling here. And I want to address two areas or rules where there's been a consensus for 40 years that technological change is now calling into question each of them. One is at the beginning of life, 14-day rule for in vitro research. The other is the prohibition on abortion after viability. And as I say, technological change in each area is moving the one further along and the abortion limits further back. And so my broader inquiry is there going to be a convergence of the twain here. And I might also say I'm playing catch up with my younger peers, Glenn and Hank, and I know Alta is into these issues as well. Well, the other two clearly apply. And so let me just start at the early end of the spectrum here with in vitro embryo research. Right from the beginning, soon after IVF in the lab was perfected, there were debates about that, and we had first the HEW, Ethics Advisory Board, calling for a 14-day rule for research on embryos in the lab. The Warnock Committee in England backed that, followed by legislation. Human Embryo Research Panel, Alta's work also followed that. And the rationale was this is the earliest stage, or the precursor stage of neurological development, the very earliest line, the primitive streak from which the neurological system would spring. And the idea in some broad sense was to avoid pain, if that were even possible then. And the important thing to remember, it was not an indicator of moral status per se. It was actually a very workable line because no one was close to doing that at the time. And now with technological change, researchers have now could go beyond 14 days, but they stopped at 13 days because they didn't want to violate the rule, calling into question perhaps extending it. But even more importantly, there's been the development of sheaths, synthetic human entities with synthetic human entities with embryo-like features, sheaths. One could say that's the least felicitous acronym that we've heard. On the other hand, we could like it. Come here, little sheaf, come here and let me deal with you. And these concern developments beyond what would happen with an embryo at 14 days, gastroloids from gastrulation stage, and ongoing to 3D printing of vascularized organs and neurolated entities. I'm going to put aside all the patent issues for the IP people here. You're probably aware of the issues with 3D printing. And the idea here is there's a polymer scaffold or perhaps a decellularized protein scaffold, and the printing is with bioink, with cells, stem cells, and other factors of various sorts. And so you can get organoids, organs, and the idea is that with time there'll be it will extend to sheaths, neurolated 3D organs, You get beating hearts in the laboratory. And indeed, Bruce Conklin, who was collaborator with Barbara Evans, is doing that in his lab at UCSF. Not the full heart, but parts of the heart, already doing that, vascularized, going on. And so this leads to a variety of issues. And, and so the issue arises is then, how should we handle these? What should the new line be? John Ash and others out of the George Church Laboratory have recently written a very powerful article that's an appeal to the bioethics community to come forward and give us guidance. So come forward and give us guidance, and they want sociological input, moral input, and evaluation of all the possible lines that could apply here. And of course, they've list some of the morally significant lines that have applied in the past, from developmental potential, morphology, the development of brainwaves, relational status to and sentience. And we can also look to, I kind of mixed up on the, oh, here it is, my order slides. But we could look to lessons from the chimera debate, which Hank and Alta were very heavily involved in. And Hank, I just want to cite your 207 article on the human neuronal mouse, which is a great review of the issues here. And as some of you may remember, for the rules for injecting human embryo stem cells into non-human animals, the human to non-human chimera there, where the issues became those of human dignity or conferring humanity on non-human animals. Is that what would happen from injecting stem cells, especially into non-human blastocysts? The fear was fear of breeding and development in non-human animals as well. And so that would be another aspect of application to sheaths. And forgive my slides here, they've got mixed up. So with regard to where then should the moral lines be, or the policy lines, here obviously we're far beyond the primitive streak now, which is too early for sentience. And most of the sheath developments, at least currently, but even for a while, will not be at the stage of sentience. So there will be consistency with rules for abortion are not going to fit here because reproductive autonomy is not involved. These are sheaths outside of the body, embryo-like entities outside of the body, so not the same issues of personal autonomy that have arisen in abortion, but there may be issues of researcher autonomy here. So I think what we're going to have to look to, obviously, is other criteria than harm-based moral status issues. So we have to look to non-harm criteria, bringing in what the special respect that's more a symbolic concern mean in this context when we move beyond the 14-day line or the non-embryo derived line with sheaths. And I think what we're going to need here, and as other policy developments that have occurred, obviously we want a marker, we want a recognition that the enterprise is careful and controlled, not secretly being done, with open, limits need to be open, articulated, and of course revised and monitored in some public debate. We also need a sense that they will not be gestated or brought to sentience. And here, William Hurlbut's idea, some of you may remember from the President's Council on Bioethics with human stem cell research, had hatched the idea of altered nuclear transfer, which would have stem cells, human stem cells that could not proceed beyond a certain level of development. And it seems to me that that will have to be built into sheaths and these other entities as well, a built-in senescence or termination. It reminds one of the film Blade Runner, where there's a limited lifespan built in, but that was for replicants of humans. These are for human-like entities, but they have not reached that stage. And of course, we will need sheath rows to take care of this matter, okay? Sheath review committees. So we're going to go down that line, trying to figure out what non-human, what non-harm criteria that still show respect for human dignity and are not conferring full human dignity on these things will be, but it will be a process, a long process. Now, let me contrast that with at the other end here. And if we go back to technological changes in abortion, we're well aware Roe v. Wade set the limit at viability, estimating at 24 to 26 weeks. And it was clear viability was a medical determination, ability to survive outside the womb. Query, if you could survive outside the womb, why did you have to stay in the womb? There's always that ironic paradox in the viability line. And of course now with neonatal intensive care progress and other developments, viability appears to have moved back to about 22 weeks, but that's without any inclusion of mental, but that would include disabilities and mental challenges that would arise even at 22 weeks with very premature newborns. Some will survive, but they will survive with a fair degree of deficit here. And so the issue now, the technology claim, is that we have now new neuroscience evidence about when pain starts in fetuses. And while the consensus in the field, and there have been expert commissions on this from in the UK, a Royal Commission, and then later in JAMA, the consensus is it's really not before 24 or 26 weeks or even later. There are an outlier or two, a neurologist that has been feted by the Right to Life community who claims that the thalamic cortical sensors and network that is essential to feel pain is developed much earlier, maybe as early as 16 weeks. The idea that from the film Silent Scream, where a fetus is shown reacting to a prod in utero at 13 weeks, that's been discounted. That's not a sign of pain, that's a reflex. Though ironically, anesthesia is now given for in utero or ex utero fetal surgery. And so we're going to have to learn how to deal with this. And so this will move, the idea is this has led to many state laws now moving the ban on abortion to 20 weeks, supposedly to protect the fetus from pain. Obviously this conflicts with viability, which at the best stage would be at 22 weeks. And so it would require a Supreme Court revision of the viability line to uphold this. And of course, the question here will be, will the Supreme Court defer to legislative judgment about this? And in Gonzalez v. Carhart, it had a very important passage that if there's a change, if there's a disagreement between experts, we'll defer to the legislature. I think that's been overcome in Hellerstedt, which is giving a lot of power to the courts to review the nature of legislative data. So it may be that the Supreme Court or the lower courts will weigh into this. And the question is, will sentience become a marker of moral status and thus no abortion thereafter, the way viability has been? Or is it something that people doing abortions must do them in a way that avoids pain to the fetus, such as an injection of potassium chloride, digoxin, or transecting the umbilical cord in utero before removal of the fetus? Now, all three of those are extremely difficult to do for an abortion clinic. The idea of a big needle directly into the abdomen to hit the fetal heart and to inject potassium chloride, maybe Mark Evans, the leading practitioner of this, in his high-tech lab can do it, but to expect Planned Parenthood in Houston or anywhere else to do it is a challenge. The same thing with digoxin. And the idea of going into the cervix and first transecting the umbilical cord, which is very, very thin there at this point, to then cause the death in utero before abortion makes it difficult as well. So these are some of the issues that the court will have to deal with here. And so what I want to now talk is about the possible convergence of the twain, if you will, that we're moving forward with outside of the uterus, with embryos possibly, and also sheaths, which are embryo-like. And at the other end, there's some movement back the other way, which will come back. And so let us just for a moment imagine an artificial uterus say from day 14 or later to the NICU, which would be capable of gestating outside of the body of a woman, a embryo or other entity here. And so the questions that might rise as well when the twain converges. If we're talking about treatments for infertility, would couples retain their ability to decide on going forward with continuing a fetus that's in an artificial uterus? Wouldn't that show that the fetus is already viable because it could be maintained outside of the woman, which suggests that then you need some other standard for that? On the other hand, if we're talking about research IVF or with sheaths here, the question is, well, who will control that? Will termination be mandatory at some stage here? Or will researchers have some sense of that? So what lies ahead? Well, obviously the challenge is preserving autonomy and human dignity, and we know what serves repro or researcher interests may end up changing meanings of personhood, family, respect for life, humanity. And it also reminds me of the Robert Earl Keen song, The Road Goes On Forever. Well, we might say the debates go on forever, and bioethics never ends. So thank you. In Robert Earl Keen, the party never ends. So road goes on forever, the party never ends. The bioethics is the party. Well, questions? Not a single. Well, let me take Sonia, and then we'll go to Alta. Sonia.
So I just wanted to, you were suggesting that Hellerstedt potentially overcomes the problems of Gonzalez about deference. Just wanted to challenge you on that, because didn't the court say in Hellerstedt that there was no statement about legislative findings, and so we don't know what they would do if the legislature were to offer findings? Would that?
I don't read Hellerstedt that way, and of course, even if there were findings in Gonzalez, and some of them were rejected by the court. And of course, the deference to the legislature in Gonzalez concerned simply the question about whether the partial birth abortion procedure was ever necessary for a woman's health. It was on that more narrow question. It seemed to give a large role to deference to the legislature, but only in that narrow issue. And since there was a conflict about that, and that seems to be Hellerstedt in overcoming all the evidence from the state in the record, even though they didn't cite findings as such, they cited the fact that Gonzalez had rejected findings as such. Alta?
I just found myself thinking about Hans Martin Sass, who many years ago had suggested we move toward a nice, elegant symmetry of brain birth and brain death, which would have pushed the criminalization of abortion back very early to the primitive street and maintain the kind of brain death, loss of the brain stem. Seems to me that you're kind of creating a symmetry here too, but it's more about sentience birth and sentience death, which has a lot of implications for PBS.
For PVS?
For PBS, that is,
well,
are you thinking in terms of trying to have a kind of common standard that applies at all stages of human development for when it is that we need to respect it, and sentience being that standard?
Maybe at a later point, that'd be the grand synthesis of this theory of life. But I would see that these are somewhat separate areas. And of course, in PVS, there isn't sentience. There's still life. There's not brain dead. So there may be special rules there. And of course, here, the emergence of brain detectable activity in the brain of the fetus, which comes very early, maybe as early as 8 weeks or so, still is not equivalent to sentience. And here I need help from a neuroscientist. Do we have a neuroscientist here? I think we have one, right? But don't we have and with all the neuroscience we're talking about here, how little of it has focused on the development of sentience itself. Did you want to add anything, Jennifer, on that? I don't know. You don't know? Is there another neuroscientist? No? Is there a neuroscientist in the house? No. There. Yes.
That's my question. Is it possible to develop some kind of a medical definition of sentience? I guess that we would have, that's why we're looking at the neuroscientists, because I would imagine it's really challenging. Yeah.
Well,
We use animal models to study various aspects of behavior, including intentional and goal-directed behavior, and you can use animal models, primate models, to which we don't attribute the same kind of moral issues, but they are in some sense sentient or but I think it's definitional.
well, but the way the argument goes is that there is a neurological substrate or neurological wiring, if you will, for pain to be experienced by the other methods that we determine pain, that reactions, and so right now the debate is, right, would at least be necessary, but that's where the debate is with this one expert. I haven't noticed that others have been brought in, that all the right to lifers cite his studies, his claim that there is a neurological substrate capable of feeling pain. Chris, did you want to? Yeah, so that's really what the debate is about. Okay, well, thanks. Thanks. Very good.